Were being watched from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed we were being scrutinized as someone with a microscope studies creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. Few men even considered the possibility of life on other planets. And yet, across the gulf of space, minds immeasurably superior to ours.
And good evening, depending upon where you are. Out here in sunny Southern California, it's still good afternoon, but today should have been the third return of Dark Matters Radio to KGRA. We were supposed to have a show last Monday. However, if you remember your news reports, we had a tropical storm hit us that used to be a hurricane, and lo and behold, we lost all our power. Matter of fact, I couldn't even call KGRA to let them know. My phone went out with the power. I can't get a cell signal, so I had to literally drive down the hill to be able to let them know that, hey, we were without power, but we are back. Tonight, we're going to have a very special show. Along with Martine, who is helping move this process along, and my buddy Mark Center. Hey, this is going to be great because my guest this evening is Dr. Kevin Randle. Now, Kevin and I go back a very, very long time, over 30 years, more like 32, maybe even 33 years. I first met Kevin when he was working in partnership with Don Schmidt, and they were some of the top Roswell investigators around anywhere. And over the years, we've done a number of interviews on all types of things. Kevin has been working in this field for many, many years and has done a hell of a job. He's left a hell of a footprint. And with that being said, I'd like to bring him on board. Kevin, welcome back. It's been too long, my friend. How you doing?
I'm hanging in there, Don. How are you doing?
We're doing okay, Kevin. We're doing okay. Now, what I basically wanted to do this evening with you, I wanted to hit some of the highlights of your career in the field. And I wanted to later on get into this frothing disclosure business that's happening right now with some of the well, I got to tell you, I've looked at a lot of this stuff with a somewhat jaundiced eye. I have a feeling you may have also. But hey, let's get started. Back in the 70s, I know you were working in conjunction with the folks at APRO, weren't you? Jim and Coral Lorenzen?
Yeah, Jim and Coral Lorenzen were very good friends of mine. In fact, they helped get me launch my writing career. I was doing articles back in those days. There were like 6 magazines that dealt with UFOs, and because there were 6 of them, they were looking for material. So I had an easy chance or an easy way to break into the field. But Coral Lorenzen and Jim Lorenzen would provide me with information. The only caveat was that I had to put the name of the organization and the address someplace in the article. No big deal. And then that would be published. It would help promote their organization, and it would help me pay for my college education. So yes, I knew Coral and Jim Lorenz. I visited them in Arizona a couple of times and that sort of thing. I kept up with them up until the mid 1980s. And then I think both Jim and Coral got sick. So they were pretty well out of it at that point.
Yeah, they ended up passing on. Well, look, in those early days, now I have an insidious reason for mentioning this, but in those early days, did you have a chance to bump into Bill Moore?
No, never did. I knew that he was, at some point, I guess he got on the board of directors. He lived in Arizona, I think, and he was on the board of directors for a while, but I never met him at APRO at all.
And what about when his book came out, the Roswell book?
I ignored it. I was very, I guess, jaundiced toward the idea of UFO crashes after the great Aztec boondoggle, and the number of articles that came out that exposed that as a hoax. And it was kind of I suppose, a method or a way of thinking in the UFO field that UFOs don't crash, and these stories of UFO crashes were ridiculous. And there were others circling around, but Aztec was the big one, and that had been proven to be a hoax. So when the book came out, I just thought it was the Aztec story dressed up in a different cloak. So I pretty much ignored it.
Well, what about when Stanton Friedman popped out of the woodwork on this?
Oh, I was unaware of his involvement in the book until the 1990s. And he was always complaining to Don and me about how he had been promised a substantial compensation for his efforts in the book. And he was supposed to be named as one of the authors on the book and all of that sort of thing. But I had not had any communication with Friedman until after Don and I began the Roswell investigation.
Well, when did you decide to take a look at Roswell, Kevin?
Don and I were I was at a science fiction convention called XCon in Milwaukee, and there was going to be a debate between science fiction writers and UFO people. I was one of the science fiction writers. I'd published a number of books, and I know Frederick Pohl was on the panel. I think George R.R. Martin was the third writer on the panel. I think it was George R.R. Martin. And we were going to debate these guys coming up from the Center for UFO Studies. Well, when they showed up, it was just Don Schmidt. And I didn't think it was fair to 3 against 1. So I switched sides to the pro-UFO side because it was a debate. So it really didn't matter which side you took. I knew enough I could take either side. And after that, I talked to Don. I interviewed him. I was completing a book called the UFO Case Book, and what I was doing there was just retyping magazine articles I'd done and added some new material that I hadn't done before. And so I interviewed Don Schmidt about it. And several weeks later, I got a call from him, and they were going to reinvestigate the Roswell case. Don Schmidt and the center were going to reinvestigate the UFO crash there. Wanted to know if I would join them. I think the thinking was, being military, I would maybe relate to some of the witnesses better than a civilian. I would understand the jargon and that sort of thing, understand the relationships. And they wanted to know if I would go down to Roswell and help with the investigation. I said, sure, why not? Now, I went down there, and I think Don had the same attitude, that we were going to go down there and we'd spend 2 or 3 days and we would come up with a solution, and that would be the end of that nonsense. And it kind of worked out that way for the first few days. We went down there to meet Frank Joyce, the radio announcer from KGFL in Roswell at the time. He begged off because he was sick. We were going to interview some people at a UFO organization in Albuquerque, and they were way off into the new age. So that didn't work out. We went to Roswell. We met up with Cliff Stone. He doesn't want to meet us at his house for some bizarre reason. We had to meet him at the Burger King, and he shows up in his Army uniform. and the whole thing about not meeting us at his house seemed ridiculous to me because his address was in the telephone book. And then, of course, we talked to him for a while, and then we went to his house, and it turned out he was kind of a yo-yo. He said, at one point, he says, I've got to go out and get somebody out of the car. And he walks back through the house, and he's got a document with a top secret cover sheet on it. And I said to Don, if that's really a top secret document, he's going to jail, because I'm pretty sure he doesn't have a vault in that room he just went into. Because top secret has to be stored in a vault, not a safe, in a vault. And he was lecturing us on UFOs, and he said, and the Chilean Air Force fired at a UFO and hit it, and there was no damage. It had no effect. And I said, can you prove that? And he handed me the telegram or whatever, the documentation. And what it said was they'd fired on it without results. Well, it didn't mean they hit it. It just mean they didn't have any results. He kind of leaped to that stuff. And so he was pretty useless. Then we went to meet Bill Brazel, and he turned the whole thing around. I mean, here's a guy, the son of the man that found it. He found bits and pieces himself, described it to us, and suddenly it began to take some shape. We understood what was going on, and we were going back to Albuquerque to catch the plane home. I said to Don, we've got to come back. And so we came back a month or two later, and so began the investigation really in earnest. We were able to talk to the family of the sheriff and other witnesses and a whole bunch of other things going on in the Roswell area. So we learned more about what was going on, and it became clearer that something had fallen, something truly unusual had fallen, and the Air Force explanation didn't make any sense. So we took it from that point.
So
Well, it's, oh, excuse me, Mark, go ahead.
No, that's fine. So that was already 50 years, right? So
It was 1989. So
okay.
it was 40 plus years.
So with what you knew about the case at that point, were the stories still consistent?
Well, I didn't really know much about the case, and after Don and I talked briefly, I decided I didn't want to know anything about the case, what the other people had done, until we got into it. I didn't want my investigation to be influenced by what had gone on beforehand. So I pretty well stayed away from that sort of thing. The one thing I'd done, I did talk to Bill Brazel briefly, and what he said to me was concerning his interview, and I have to phrase it that way, was everything in the book is true, meaning his interview. There's a lot of stuff in the Roswell incident book that is not true. And in fact, Bill Moore described it as this disgraceful hodgepodge of fact and fiction. And I think that's a wonderful description of the book, and I'm going to run with that one every chance I get. But neither Don and I had really looked into the case in depth before we got into it. We knew a couple of things about it, but we wanted to come into it as unbiased as we could and look at it, I guess, with a fresh set of eyes.
Back in April of 1994, I had received a call from a television producer I knew about something I had not heard about up to that point, called flying rods. Okay. And so I talked to this guy, and he said, hey, would you consider going down to Roswell, New Mexico, because down at Roswell, there's a guy by the name of Jose, and by God, I can't for the life of me think of his last name. He had been up here in LA for years, was somehow affiliated to the television industry, but his family was back in New Mexico, so he went back down there. And anyway, he had been videotaping these things with his camcorder and VHS tape. I mean, we're talking early stuff, right? And I saw a video of this, and I said, well, yeah, that is kind of weird. Don't know what it is. My first guess would be insects. But anyway, I said, sure. So I went down there with Dwight Schultz. And we got down there, went out and met with Jose. He took us to where he was shooting this stuff. Kevin, it was a horse corral. Okay. And I told him right up front.
Funny you would say horse corral and okay, like an okay corral.
Yeah. And I told him, I said, dude, those are not flying rods. Those are flying insects. And he got all huffy. He was upset about that. But anyway, we decided at that time there were 2 UFO museums in Roswell. One was the one that I guess is still there. The other was run by a guy by the name of John Price. That has since closed down. But Schultz and I went down to that one. Went in. John Price came out. He knew who I was. We shook hands. Oh, man, it's great to have you down here. Hey, I got a guy you got to talk to. He's in the back room. And I said, well, who is that? He said, well, he's an older gentleman by the name of Thomas Gonzalez. And he claims to have been a member of the 509th Bomb Group. I've got a copy of their annual or yearbook or whatever the hell it was with all the troops at that time photoed in there. And he's looking for his picture right now. So we went in, I introduced myself to him, and he was a member of T Squadron. This is what he told me. And his squadron was one of the groups of people that were sent out to clean up the debris after the incident, whatever the incident was. And it's a long story, but let me just cut to the chase. Schultz and I were supposed to fly out of Roswell. We had to get back to the airport. Now, getting into Roswell then was a monumental task anyway. They had one airfield, no radar, puddle jumper airplanes would fly in and fly out. We went out to the airport to catch our flight. Guess what? The plane had broken down. We couldn't leave. We were stuck there. So Dwight went up to the counter, was trying to talk to this lady, and I got a Grammy Award-winning performance of Schultz going off on them, telling them how they were going to put us up for the night and pay for our dinner, which they ended up doing. So the next day, I had called John, and I said, hey, by the way, I'd love to talk to that guy again. What happened? He said, well, after you guys left, he just got up and walked out. Then the next thing we knew, the Roswell police were looking for this guy. Why? Well, his family down in Texas, Tomball, Texas, his family said he disappeared. Well, being an ex-cop, I kind of got my teeth into that, and I figured out what had happened. He had been living with one of his kids, a daughter, who had a kid or two, divorced, and she was sucking his paycheck, his Social Security check dry. And he got tired of that. So they had a big argument. He got up and split. But at that time, he had seen a commercial for Paul David's movie, Roswell. Y'all remember that? I know, Kevin, you do. You were in it.
Yes, it's based on our book.
Yes, you were in the movie. And he thought the 509th Bomb Group was having a reunion, not realizing that this was a commercial for a film. So he said, hey, I'm going to get on a bus and go up to Roswell, which is what he did. So I started looking for him, and I couldn't find him anywhere. And I ended up calling the post office down in Tomball, and I talked to a lady down there, and she gave me a name of apparently one of his kids. I called this guy up, and it turned out that they had found their dad. They brought him back, and their dad was living with him now. So Dwight, Vicky, and I got on an airplane. I wanted to get him on videotape. So we flew down there. We met up with him. The old guy was a sweet fella. I don't know if he was 100% on the ball then, because he was up in years. But to make a long story short, we did about an hour or more long interview. Kevin, I sent you a copy of that on the videotape that I did. And the one reason we really wanted to connect with this guy, he told me he had kept a piece of the debris that he had picked up on the field that nobody knew about. And his entire life, and his kids knew about this, he had it sitting on top of his television set, and he just called it the Rock, but it wasn't, according to him. So I said, oh, Mr. Gonzalez, my God, do you have any idea where it is? And he said, well, no. Now, his home that he had been living in with his wife had passed away a few years before this, and they ended up tagging his home. So we got permission, Dwight, Vicky, and I got permission from him to go down, and we spent an entire day crawling through that house, looking for anything that might have been the rock. Finally came out that it was probably in his property that he had stored in a storage locker that his daughter that he had had the blow up with had the key to. So one of his boys called this girl to see if she would give them this key so we could search through this property to find this thing. Now, if it was real, my God, at the time, that would have been the smoking gun about Roswell. Because remember all the BS that the Air Force had put out about that case. First, it was a weather balloon, then it was a top secret acoustic balloon, then it was something else. They had been lying through their teeth about whatever it was that happened. Well, the girl would not give anybody the key. She was pissed, and she was going to make the old man pay because, after all, he had taken his Social Security check with him. So that ended up being a very interesting little side trip. But Kevin, what you watched that video? What was your overall? Because the old man claimed that there was at least one survivor of that crash. He called them the Moon Men, and as a matter of fact, he had even carved some little statues of these guys that he had given me. You saw those, didn't you, Kevin? I showed them to you.
I have pictures of them. I've used them in books.
Yeah.
With your permission. And I did talk to him as well. My main concern was talking to him as I just wanted to make sure I had the copy of the article you'd written in UFO magazine. And I was just verifying that information. And it was a short conversation with him. And he said, yeah, everything that was in that article that you had written for UFO magazine was true. He did say that he had been transferred out of the base shortly thereafter. And we had been looking at the unit histories, which gave us the strength at the 509th Bomb Group, or the whole base there in Roswell Army Airfield. And we didn't find a big shift in the numbers of soldiers assigned to the base. But then I found a letter from Edwin Easley or a report from Edwin Easley, who was the base provost marshal, the top cop on the base, complaining that while the numbers of soldiers assigned to his units had not decreased significantly, the men that had been there in early July of 1947 had been transferred out. And so what they were doing was they were transferring the people out who had been involved in the retrieval operation to other units so they couldn't discuss it with one another, and bringing in other people. So the numbers still matched. The numbers were still good, but it wasn't the same people. So when you look at the yearbook, and that was, you talked about the yearbook, and I've used that as a source as well. If somebody calls and says, well, I was in Roswell in 1947, the first thing you do is look in the yearbook to see if there are pictures there. If it's not, it doesn't mean they weren't there. It just means they're not in the yearbook. If there are pictures there, then it's good. In fact, I know the yearbook was done by Walter Hott. I think he began it in like May of 1947, and they submitted it to the publisher in August of 1947 and had the things back by November of 47. So the people who are in the yearbook pretty much were the people assigned to the base in July of 1947. So, that's one thing that we always do. But I talked to Thomas Gonzalez, and I was convinced that he was telling the truth as he knew it. Now, on the other side of that coin, Frankie Rowe was the daughter of a firefighter at Roswell in 1947, Dan Dwyer. And the story was that the Roswell Fire Department had made a run outside the city limits to this crash site, this burned area. But we could find no record of it. because I went through they had the records, and I went through the records for 1947. They didn't make a run out to the outside of the city limits in the proper time frame, but they did make runs outside the city limits. And it finally came up that, talking to one of the other firefighters, it came out that Dan Dwyer, let me backtrack. It came out that a colonel, it's always a colonel, never a lieutenant, never a captain, always a colonel, had come to the fire department and said, "You guys don't have to make the run out here. We'll handle it. It's something that we need to do." But Dwyer went out in his personal car. So it wasn't a fire department run. It was him going out in his personal car. And the whole point of this is Dwyer had said that there were a couple of bodies and one of them was still alive. So that kind of confirms what Thomas Gonzalez said from another source, completely unrelated to the 509th or what Thomas Gonzalez said. And none of that information had come out at the time we were talking to Thomas Gonzalez, nor did Frankie Rowe know that information at the time, because it was all the debris field, and the bodies were recovered over on the plains of San Augustine, which turned out to be kind of a red herring in the whole story. So we have other witnesses who were involved in the case. We can verify were there at the time, saying sort of the same thing about one of them had survived the initial crash. The debris field that Mac Brazel found was up near Corona, New Mexico, some 65 or 70 miles away from Roswell as the crow flies. The actual impact site where they found the actual craft and the bodies was much closer to Roswell. And we had a number of people in the beginning of the investigation saying, Louis Rickett, who was part of the counterintelligence corps there, talking about he and Sheridan Cabot, the captain of the counterintelligence, had gone out to the crash site, and he said it was only 45 minutes from Roswell. Well, the site up near Corona is a good 3 hours from Roswell, based on the way the roads ran and things like that. So there's a lot of corroboration going on for various parts of the story. So we know that there was the debris field that Mac Brazel found. There was a site that Dee Proctor talked about between it, and there was a third site much closer to Roswell, closer to Highway 285.
Well, let's jump ahead a bit. In the last several years, since actually starting around December of 2017, with now deceased former senior Senator Harry Reid from Nevada holding a press conference announcing that he and two other legislators had secured roughly $22 million to begin this aerial threat assessment program. And Kevin and I both know that $22 million in the Department of Defense is like pocket change, if that. Okay. It's really not a lot of money. Although if I had 22 million bucks, that'd be pretty nice. But
if you had 10% of it, it'd be pretty nice.
Yeah, really. But the bottom line was, suddenly, inexplicably, UFOs became okay to talk about. And then on the heels of the disclosure of the Nimitz battle group that encountered their F-18 Super Hornets, encountering those so-called Tic Tacs, suddenly it's like the entire UFO subject got a boost. Now, in the last year or so, there have been congressional hearings on the UFO topic, UFO/UAP, okay? And one of the witnesses that testified, although this guy did have a career in the armed forces, in the Air Force, did have top security clearance, did not have firsthand encounters with anything he talked about. This was all information he received from colleagues that were second and even third hand. He talked about an uber secret government project to not only recover these things if they came down, but other things like biologicals. They can't say bodies anymore. It's all biological, which is a crap of shit in my book anyway. I mean, let's talk straight. That's what, in my opinion, one of the problems with this world today is nobody talks straight. But one of the things that Grush said that stuck in my mind is that the government recovered at least a dozen or possibly more UAP objects. Now, Kevin, Roswell is first and foremost, okay, allegedly a recovered extraterrestrial vehicle. And if there are a dozen or more that have been recovered by our military, something about that just simply struck me oddly. If these things are in fact as technologically advanced as we're being led to believe, and hey, what the hell? They came from another star system. That's pretty advanced. If they did, why would they suddenly start falling out of the sky here on planet Earth? Now, I thought about that. I'm a combat veteran. Kevin is a combat veteran. We've both been in places where aircraft were shot down. We've been in places where, things have been pretty hairy, to say the least. And the only thing that made sense to me, unless they have a really shitty maintenance crew, is that something else were causing these things to go down. And it hit me. What if there were some type of conflict happening right now in near Earth space and throughout our solar system? If there were and a craft was damaged, where would it make sense for them to come to? To a planet that is habitable. Kevin, what do you think about that?
I'm worried about the fact that he talks about 12 craft. He mentioned 2 in various interviews. One is, of course, Roswell, which he just touched on briefly. And the other was something that happened in Italy in 1933, I think it was. And that the United States got their hands on it in 1944, 1945, after Italy was out of the Second World War. Colleagues in Italy who investigated this rumor 20 years ago decided it was a hoax. The documentation that was offered is, the best way to describe it is like MJ-12 documents. You can't get any provenance on them. You don't know where they came from. There's no history for them. They just appear in the program. So my problem is, if he's talking about this Italian crash as if it was one of these 12, I'm bothered because it's a hoax. And we don't know who his witnesses are. We do not know what other cases they may be talking about. And if we have 12 of them, how many do the Russians have? How many do the Chinese have? Because they're not now crashing in the United States. They must be falling in other parts of the world. And so it kind of suggests something that I think he may not have understood what he was hearing when he overheard these conversations, or when they talked to him, that he was fooled by this sort of thing. Because if we follow your scenario, Don, and they're looking for a place to land, I would suspect they wouldn't just land in the United States. They would be landing all over the world, and we just don't have that kind of information. And everybody would know about it. The Russians would know about it, and the Europeans would know about it, and the Africans would know about it, and the South Americans would know about it, and the Australians would know about it. I mean, everybody would know about it, and you couldn't keep that secret with that many different governments involved in that sort of thing. So I just don't know what to make of what Grush has said. I am bothered by the fact that he has no firsthand knowledge. He said he talked to 40 witnesses over 4 years, and I'm thinking, I've talked to 10 times that number over 30 years. And unfortunately, a lot of the witnesses turned out not to be very reliable, and we pointed that out as soon as we learned about their reliability. But I just don't think there's that many crashes, and I think that others have heard things that they communicated to him, and they may have gotten the information skewed in some fashion, because we don't know who the sources are. We don't know where the crashes are. We don't have any of the information. He said in the last congressional hearing he was at, he was asked specific questions about that. He said, well, I can't talk to you about that here. I'll talk to you about that in camera, in secret rooms where we can discuss these things. The other thing that has come out about this in just the last week, and I put it up on, I mentioned it Thursday night on my Coast to Coast broadcast, that the chairman of the Oversight Committee has suggested that they not hold any more congressional hearings because it would reflect badly on the Department of Defense. So we may have seen the last hearings. And what we've seen in the hearings is the fact that nobody's talking about anything we don't know about. In fact, one of the hearings they held earlier on with the Department of Defense representatives, they asked them about the case at Malmstrom Air Force Base in 1967. And they said, well, we don't know anything about that. And I was surprised the congressional representative did. Later on, the guy said that, he had heard something about that. This is the case where the UFO apparently shut down a whole flight of ballistic missiles from the outside, which is supposedly impossible to do. And that becomes an issue of national security, because if you tell our competitors in the world you can do this thing, something like that happened, then they're going to be looking for a way to do it. So anyway, there's a lot of that stuff going on. And I had a discussion earlier with somebody else about that today. And I said that Jerry Clark and others have cautioned me not to become too negative until we get the whole story. And I'm afraid we're not going to get the whole story. I'm afraid what's going to happen is they're going to play this string out as far as it goes. And that's going to be the end of it. We're not going to hear anything about it. The other thing is, if you talk to the man on the street, somebody who's not into the UFO community, they really don't know that much about what's happening. You know, I have friends who come to me and say, what have you heard about this? And I'm thinking, well, you know, you've heard as much as I have. Actually, I've sat through the meetings that were broadcast. I sat through the stupid hours long NASA meeting, and another one where the committee was going to, Senate committee was going to investigate it, looking at the head guy of Arrow, that Dr. Kirkpatrick. And it turned out that it was more, well, these are the logistics we're following, and this is what we're attempting to do. And that's what it's always been. It hasn't been, here's what we found. Here's this information. Here's this evidence we've accumulated. It's, well, we're gathering this stuff and we're reviewing this and we're going to do that. We're going to do that. So I just don't think it's going to go anywhere. I'm afraid it's not going to go anywhere. And I'm very worried about Grush's statements about that Italian crash, because it took me about 2 hours on the internet to get that thing researched out, to find out what was going on. And as I said, I've got colleagues, friends in Italy who investigated. I put that information up on my blog too. Their information about why this Italian crash is probably a hoax. And if Grush is on the inside and he didn't know that, then that calls into question some of the other information he's spread.
Well, you and I both know that this field is, in the United States, littered with groundbreaking events involving UFOs. Maelstrom is just one of them. And it bothers me that this committee has not taken a look at the historical record of this going back to at least 1947. My God, Kevin, one of the biggest events ever happened in July and early August of 52, when the skies of Washington, D.C. were basically invaded by unknown objects. And it was amazing. Most people today are not even aware of that, and it was on front page news all across the country.
Well, let me interrupt, Doug, because I want to say one thing. The greatest headline I've ever seen in a newspaper is right out of a science fiction movie. It was a banner headline on the Cedar Rapids Gazette. It said, "Saucers swarm over Capitol." I mean, you've got to admit that was something you see like an Earth versus the flying saucer. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It was headline news, banner headlines around the country. I did a book called about the Washington National sightings, which you're talking about. The other thing is there was another case in Texas in November of 1957 in Levelland, where the object was seen. The object was seen by, the sheriff said, hundreds of people, and it stalled cars. It interacted with the environment. It left landing traces. And the argument boiled down to the number of witnesses. The Air Force said there were only 3 people that saw the craft. Don Kehoe from the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon said there were 9 witnesses. And if you go through the Air Force files, you can find the names of at least 13. But the sheriff himself was reported in the newspaper saying there were hundreds of phone calls into his office about this craft. So you're absolutely right. There's been multiple events that if we had investigated them properly at the time, you and I would not be having this discussion tonight.
But my point being, nobody has brought any of this historical data about this phenomena up to the congressional hearings.
Well,
and how can they not do that?
They're one reason they're not going to do it, especially with Grush. There's already proof that he's been holding hands with Corbell and Knapp and Lou Alessandro, or however you say his
Elizondo,
name.
yeah.
They've got photos of them from the last couple of years together that came out. And did it surprise anybody that on the right and the left-hand side of Grush was Knapp and Corbell? What were they doing there? I guess they wanted to get on TV, right? Problematic. All this is problematic.
Well, and that's the real point is in the hearings, we haven't heard anything we didn't already know. Those of us who've been around the field for more than 15 minutes, we're aware of all of that stuff. We'd heard that. Did the Navy pilots add anything to our knowledge of UFOs? I mean, here are 2 very reliable witnesses, and they're talking about some anomalous object they've seen. We don't know what it is. We don't know what the investigations have shown, but they're very, very credible. And centered is Grush, who's talking about all this other stuff going on. Yep. And we're not really getting any new information.
With those crashes, while a lot of them did crash, he did mention that a few of them were totally intact with no more information, like we vectored them down with flashlights like Greer does, and they just landed and we took control of them, right?
And we don't, like I said, the only 2 we know of that he's mentioned is this 1933 thing from Italy and Roswell. And he didn't say anything about Roswell at all, but that 1933 thing has been out. Now I have heard, and I have not been able to verify this, that Grush was out at Skinwalker Ranch. Now it doesn't matter what you think about that sort of thing. The point there is that it puts him into contact with people like Christopher Mellon. And that kind of, for me, impacts his credibility. Jerry Clark told me, don't rush to judgment just because he was at Skinwalker Ranch. And I'm thinking, I'm not worried about the Skinwalker Ranch. I'm worried about the people he would have come in contact with at the Skinwalker Ranch.
I always found Jerry to be a little soft.
Pardon me?
I always found Jerry Clark to be rather soft, up top, upstairs.
Well, I think he's very good, and his UFO encyclopedias are a wonderful research. I mean, if you're going to do UFO research, you've got to have in your library his books, his UFO encyclopedias, because they're loaded with all kinds of good information. So I have a respect for Jerry Clark and what he's done in his research. And as I say, and Jerry Clark was right. And I think Mike Swords has said sort of the same thing. We don't want to rush to judgment on this without getting all the information. But what we have to this point for people like Mark and me and you Don, is the red flags that have been raised in those discussions. We know this stuff very, very well, and we see where the things have gone off the rails. And that's what I was saying about the one congressional hearing where the congressman asked about the Malmstrom case, and the two Pentagon people pretended they didn't know a thing about it. And then later on, one of them said, well, yeah, I've heard a little bit about it. But I mean, that's a big red flag for me, because that was a legitimate issue, national security issue. Whether there are UFO involved or not, it was a legitimate national security issue.
Well, I'm gonna throw a turd in the punch bowl. Okay.
Yay!
Yummy.
I am gonna throw a turd in the punch
I hope it's a
bowl.
Tootsie Roll.
Yes.
Look, back in 1988-89, one of the biggest news stories popped out of Las Vegas, went around the world, literally galvanized people by the millions. George Knapp's report on Area 51 and Bob Lazar. Now, in full disclosure, I've been to Lazar's home. I've interviewed him in his office. I've talked to his buddy, Gene Knapp. Yes, I'm well aware of all the problems with his academic background and credentials. My God, from day one, okay? And I've always kept Lazar in my gray basket. I've never absolutely thrown the baby out with the bathwater. I've never fully embraced it. I always kind of felt maybe there is something to this. Now, look, when I was a detective, I interviewed all kinds of people about all kinds of things. And if I do say so myself, my bullshit detector is not bad, okay? Not bad. And I never once got a hint that Lazar was trying to bamboozle me. I asked him direct questions. I've interviewed him in his home. I've interviewed him numerous times on the radio. Now, with that being said, suddenly, with this explosion of information and all the things that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years, I've started to look at Lazar in somewhat of a new light. Now, am I fully on board with his story? No. Do I have any idea of the extent that intelligence and DOD would go to basically keep this undercover? Yes, I do. I guess my question, Kevin, is have you considered any of what that man has said in the last 30 plus years that might hold some relevance now?
Well, in the case of full disclosure, I have not interviewed Lazar. I have not met the man. I have not been to his house. I've heard his story. I understand his educational background, or claims of educational background, are flimsy at best. That the evidence that he worked at Area 51 is problematic. That what goes on at Area 51, I have always thought, is the development of the next generation of military aircraft, and we've seen that sort of thing. I actually took a trip to Area 51 with, believe it or not, Bob Bigelow. We had Kentucky Fried Chicken and ate it at a picnic table outside of Rachel, Nevada. We saw strange lights over the mountains, but I have not looked at the Lazar story with any kind of a critical eye. So the answer to your question is I really don't know. I tilt toward the idea that it's probably not true, but it may be. So,
well, here's the one thing that, and believe me, I kept my eye on this. The man's story has never once materially changed. Okay. He's telling the same story. He told the same story on Joe Rogan's show that he told back in 1989. Now, one thing I did make inquiries to George Knapp about. And Knapp and I ended up on one or two occasions chasing the hoot owl late at night, okay? And I asked him, I said, look, before Lazar ever popped out of the woodwork, did you have anybody else allegedly from that area that ever came forward with anything? And he said, yeah. He said, I did. And I said, okay. Now, you and I both know, George, that if we tried to erase somebody, okay, it would be damn tough, okay? If somebody wanted to erase my background, how would they go about it, about doing it and doing it successfully? There's hundreds, if not thousands of people that I knew, I interacted with, I dated, whatever, okay? Going back to my high school days, coming forward. When I was in the Army, what I did when I was in Southeast Asia. I still have a lot of those guys in my Rolodex, okay? It would be tough. Now, his background, allegedly his academic background, hey, they claim no record of it. I said, God, the guy had professors, didn't he? He had instructors. They would have to know him if they graded him or did anything else. And yeah. Well, how do you know he was out there? He said, well, I asked him questions because subject A over here that I talked to in 84 and 85 about something entirely different. I asked him, where's the cafeteria? What color were the walls? If you were in there and you had to go to the bathroom, how would you go about getting to the bathroom from the cafeteria? That type of thing. And he said, so I asked Lazar. Lazar passed that. He knew the color of the walls. He knew how to get to the bathroom. He knew this, he knew that. His supervisor, Dennis, okay, the guy was a real guy. So he said, I got to tell you, Don, he said, I'm pretty convinced. So, okay, Kevin, I wasn't there, all right? I don't know. I'm just going by what I was told. But I got to say that did color the way I look at this.
Well, I understand that. And my point is, I have not really investigated this in depth. I know what the rumors are. I know what Stan Friedman said.
But you've been around a long time. You got a good gut. Your gut tells you things. Well,
if you want to go with the gut, no, I don't really think that Lazar may have been at Area 51. The question is, did he see alien craft? That I don't know about, and I lean toward the idea he probably didn't. He spins a good tale, but I don't know the bottom line, and I could be wrong on that. I mean, I've talked to people that I thought were telling me the truth, and they gave me good answers to the questions, and I was very careful on what we were talking about, and it turned out they were making the whole thing up. I said, well, I was here in Roswell at this time. We can find no record of it. Do you have any of your military papers? Well, no, my wife got mad at me and threw them all out. I can give you travel vouchers, for crying out loud, from the 1960s when I was in the Army. I've got the other paraphernalia that you would expect somebody who's had a long career in the military. I've got all that paraphernalia. I've got copies of those. I was looking at a document the other day. It was the appointment to ward officer, and I wondered whose this was because I didn't remember the document at all. It turned out it was mine. I thought it had been handed down from the family from somebody else, and I was looking at it, but it was me who was on it. So I mean, and that was August of 1968. I've still got that document and other documents like it. I've got my shot record from when I went to Vietnam. So if I say I went to Vietnam, and they say, well, we can find no record of it. Well, here's my shot record here. Here's pictures of me actually in the field in Vietnam. So, it's that sort of thing. So was Lazar at Area 51? Probably. Did he see what he claimed to have seen? That's what I don't know.
Hey, Don, the thing about, so Knapp says that he asked him about certain things about Area 51, and he somewhat confirmed them with somebody else who had been there. So did Knapp do the same thing with the colleges? If you're going to a college, you should know that college inside and out because you're there every day, 3-4 days.
I know for a fact that Knapp was in touch with universities. Hey, look, believe it or not, we are at our very first break, ladies and gentlemen. Kevin, if you need to get a glass of water, whatever, you're going to have a couple of minutes to do it. And when we come back, more with my very special guest, Dr. Kevin Randle, right here on KGRA DB. Keep your eyes pointed up.
Hey members, the new KGRA DB app is now available on iOS and Android devices. Gain on-demand access to any KGRA DB programming. Download any show directly to your mobile device to listen or watch on the go. Go to the App Store and search KGRA DB.
Are you looking to go on a faraway journey that is magical and mysterious, reaping on mystical legends? If so, then Mysterious Adventure Tours is perfect for you. Imagine a voyage to explore ancient mysteries of Ireland, haunted majesties of Scotland, or their chilling Birth of the Vampires in Romania. These small, esoteric getaways are limited and do feel vast. So, go to MysteriousAdventureTours.com and book your trip soon.
You're listening to the KGRA Digital Broadcasting Network. We provide unparalleled coverage of trending news in the world of ufology, cryptozoology, and paranormal phenomenon. Whether you're watching our video live stream or listening to one of our audio programs, you are getting the best from world-renowned researchers and hosts, guiding you through topics the mainstream won't touch. Miss one of your favorite programs? No problem. Head over to the members area at kgradb.com for access to our massive library of award-winning content. Make contact, stay connected, only at kgradb.com.
And we are back with another hour with my guest, Dr. Kevin Randle, also Mr. Mark Center, and the guy shuffling the whole process along in studio, Martine, and of course, Bill Skywatcher back in New York. Hey, guys, did you see we've got another hurricane forming in the Gulf? This is going to be I think, an active season, huh? With any luck, maybe it'll run back up the Pacific coast. We get a little more rain up here.
Yep. Hey, I want to follow up on my thing there. I know that Knapp checked out the schools and stuff. My first observation, and then I'll go quickly to the second one with Knapp, is Did Knapp follow up with the schooling by questioning Lazar about these different campuses? Where did you eat? Where's the building you went to this class? Where's the building?
The short answer, Mark, I don't know.
Just saying.
I never got
right, but that's one way to confirm it, right? If his paperwork is gone. The other thing is the Skinwalker Ranch book that Knapp wrote is a piece of shit. And he said, there's all kinds of evidence in there. Stories. There is no evidence in that book. So if that's the kind of research that he's willing to get paid for, maybe we be careful about Knapp.
Well, of course, when all of that was going on, I was kind of busy with UFO Magazine, and there was only limited time that I could spend, regardless of how interesting I thought a particular story was. And there were a lot of things that we were dealing with back then.
Oh, yeah.
And like everything else, some things will come into your radar and you'll examine it as closely as you can. And then before you know it, boom, something else is banging on the door. So,
Mr. Randle, except your book, can you point us, fans and such, to a book or two that you would rank high that you should read to get better information on the Roswell case?
I got a book right here.
I have one of those too.
Dr. Randle, back in those days, you were only a captain. What happened?
I got promoted.
Oh,
a bigger paycheck.
Yes, I got promoted. I ended up as a lieutenant colonel, so which is much more impressive than being just a captain.
That's true. That's true.
Grush only made major. I made it all the way to lieutenant colonel.
Yeah, but Calvin Korff made it all the way to colonel.
Well, we don't know that for sure because he had a picture of him wearing both a lieutenant colonel's leaf and a full colonel's eagle on his shoulder. So we don't know what that was about.
In fact, his claim to fame now that I see on the socials is he's the only still living original Roswell researcher. Everybody else is dead. The originals.
Count Korff?
That's what he says.
Oh, another great tale from the Korfster.
So again, your book's great. Could you point the people to a book or two that they should read?
I think if you take a look at Witness to Roswell by Carey and Schmidt, there are some things, and I pointed them out to Don, that are problematic. But as an overall looking at the overall picture of Roswell, that's a pretty good book. I think that my book, Understanding Roswell, kind of puts it in a bit of a different perspective. And I did a book, Roswell in the 21st Century, that is not quite the cheerleading book that most people expected it to be, as just trying to focus it on Roswell as a cold case. So you have to just take a look at that. I think that book by Carey and Schmidt is probably the one I would go to if you weren't looking at my books.
Right. And if you had to pick, I don't know, top 2 or 3 inexplicable cases for me, one would be the sheriff who saw the strange thing in the desert. His name is escaping.
Lonnie Zamora.
Right. That's a totally inexplicable case for me. There's a couple of more, maybe the O'Hare case, very odd. But for you, if you had to give like 2 or 3 cases of things that you're just saying, dude, there's no answer here.
Well, I would go with you on Lonnie Zamora and the Socorro case. And I did a book about that, of course, called Encounter in the Desert, which looks at not just the Zamora aspect of it, but there are other witnesses that were involved. And we've always thought of Zamora as being a single witness case, and it turns out that's not true. There was a great foobar in the investigation. The people called the sheriff's or the police department before Zamora had seen the object and reported something flying over. and they never followed up on that. I mean, they didn't write down the names of the witnesses. It wouldn't have been hard to find them, given that you had the flight paths, and you could have gone to the neighborhoods and knocked on doors to see if you could find the witnesses. Nobody ever followed up on that. I'm just outraged about that. But we also know that because Captain Holder, who was investigating the case with the FBI guy, Holder was assigned to the White Sands Missile Range. They were there that very night interviewing Zamora, and in his report, Holder wrote that night, talked about 3 witnesses calling the police department. Nobody followed up on it. So yes, this is Lonnie Zamora Socorro case. I would look at level land, because once again, we had many, many witnesses. We had the craft interacting with the environment, and we had evidences of landing traces. And in my investigation, I found evidence that Air Force officers were out there and had their cars stalled. And it's all outlined in a book that cleverly was called Level Land, about that sort of thing. And of course, the Roswell case, I've got to mention the Roswell case. I'm thinking that the Washington Nationals, because of all the other stuff leading up to it and the involvement of radar at separate locations, the intercept attempts, I had an opportunity to interview people who were involved in the radar room the second night about that. So I think that the Washington Nationals hits a high spot too. But we're talking about cases that are from 1957 back to 1947, that 10-year span. Maybe Rendlesham Forest, if you wanted to go in that direction, from 1989. And again, I've talked to the witnesses involved in that case as well. Something truly anomalous happened there, and I'm not sure exactly.
But there is the Larry Warren element.
Well,
to that case.
We can ignore Larry Warren about that, because it's pretty clear that he wasn't involved at all. In fact, I've talked to Charles Halt, who was the deputy base commander and wrote the original letter that got everybody interested in it. In fact, Larry Warren lived with Russ Estes for a number of months, I guess. And,
about 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Yeah.
And
I was out. Russ Estes was a close, dear friend of mine, television guy. He lived out in Apple Valley, out in the middle of nowhere. Warren
Victorville.
Came over.
Yep.
Huh?
Victorville.
Yeah.
Lived in the Victorville area.
Warren came over, ended up living with him. I went out to see him a couple of times to see Russ, and Warren was there. And I'll never forget, Russ Estes told me that he said, because I asked him, I said, Russ, what do you think about his story? He said, I don't know, but I'll tell you this. There's something unusual about Warren. And I said, what do you mean? Every time he gets around my equipment goes on the fritz. Did he ever tell you that?
No, he didn't tell me that, but we sat down and watched the interviews that he did with Warren. And at one point, Warren was talking about he wasn't there for the first night of the events because he was in Germany. Charles Halt told me that Warren was not involved at all. Warren was talking about how he was out there with Halt and those guys that night, and Halt says no, he wasn't there. I think what happened was Warren heard the other people talking about it and sort of just plugged himself into the story. He was clearly assigned to the base. He was clearly there at the right time frame, but he was not directly involved in the events that night. And Russ told me that he just didn't accept that story. And it's very problematic about Warren being directly involved. It's kind of like I talked to a guy from Roswell, one of the MPs from Roswell, and he wasn't involved in the retrieval. He wasn't involved in security or anything like that. And he said his friends came back from that area talking about this flying saucer. And I didn't believe him until I heard about it in the newspaper, read about it in the newspaper the next day. So it's one of those things. I think that Warren overheard the story and just plugged himself into the event. He's got the events mixed up. He doesn't have them in the correct order. He talks about things that didn't happen. And I think one of the important points was he was talking about how he got closer to the thing than anybody else. And Halt said, no, he didn't. He wasn't even in the field with us that night. So
and it's my understanding that when he left the Air Force, it was not with an honorable discharge. Is that correct?
I do not know. All I can tell you is that he spent 8 months in the Air Force, and then he was discharged. I don't know the status of his discharge. I, of course, was honorably discharged from various components of the American military over the years. And I don't know if your career was like mine, Don, and you only had a single honorable discharge, but I got discharged from the Army, went into the Air Force ROTC, got discharged from the Air Force a couple of times, and then went to the Iowa National Guard after 9/11 and got discharged from active duty after Iraq, and then finally retired from the Iowa National Guard in 2009. So
I got two.
And you've got
two discharges.
And you got a master's and a PhD.
Yes, I did. And for those who question the legitimacy of my degrees, and we won't mention any names, Calcorf.
Right.
I have a degree from the University of Iowa. Anybody can check and see that, a fully accredited university. I have a master's in the art of military science from the American Military University, which is a fully accredited institution, and my degree is cum laude. And I have both a master's degree and a PhD from California Coast University, which is a fully accredited university. You can go online and look up the accreditation from any of those organizations, University of Iowa, American Military University, or California Coast. You'll find out that they're all accredited universities. So if you want to question the credentials, that's fine. I will freely admit that having an online degree, PhD, is not really as impressive as having one from, say, MIT or Stanford. But you know, we do what we have. When I was looking to do a graduate work, I found one PhD program. You had to have fluency in 2 foreign languages. And I'm thinking, I'm not even sure I'm fluent in English. Got to have 2 other languages, you know, let alone all this other stuff. So, I mean, it really depends on the program. You want to be unimpressed with the PhD from California Coast, that's fine with me. I rarely mention that. I'm more impressed with being a lieutenant colonel because it took me 20 years to get there.
No, I'm glad that you put that on the record on the video, because anybody can go back and then write it all down and go look if they want. I want your view on, and this is what one of the people in the chat asked as well, your view on the Battle of Los Angeles, that whole weirdness that happened.
I think that's a good way to describe it, that weirdness. I'm not sure that it had an alien component. I know the main picture that everybody looks at was altered by the newspaper.
Right.
When they published it, because it wasn't as clear as it could be. And we're talking about 1941 technology. 42.
Yeah.
Sorry. Talking about that technology and the printing of the newspapers. I mean, the pictures you see in the newspapers today are very crisp and very clear, and sometimes they're weren't that great back in that time frame. I looked at that thing, did a little bit of research on it. Clearly, they were shooting up into the sky. I don't know exactly what they were shooting at. I'm thinking of John Belushi in 1941.
Yeah,
which explains some of the hysteria that was going on in a kind of a funny bit of filmmaking there.
Right.
But I really don't know on that one. I'm a little bit ambivalent about it, but it's one of those things that at this point is very hard to gather additional information and find out exactly what was going on and what they were doing. And there was a lot of debris falling out of the sky from all the anti-aircraft that they were firing.
Right.
A couple of people actually had heart attacks.
Yeah.
And I believe one, maybe 2 people died from those heart attacks.
Yeah, I think it was 2. But I'm like you. I'm not sure. I know that there were fatalities involved, but it's given the timing of the thing, given what was going on in the world, given on the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't that far in the past, and there was a great concern about California being attacked. So,
Right.
And actually, it was. Actually, California was attacked by the Imperial Japanese Navy.
oh, so was Iowa. Big deal.
No. I'm talking about submarines
Oh,
surfacing.
I'm talking about balloon bombs.
Yeah. Well, that
So-
was you. We suffered after the war in Utah. Minister and family and a bunch of people were having
Oh,
a
yeah.
picnic.
Yeah.
They
No, it was-
found one of those things.
No, it was
They
Kalamazoo
found one.
Falls. It was Oregon. It was Kalamazoo Falls, Oregon. It was before the war ended.
Right.
The
right.
only fatalities by enemy action on continental United States during the Second World War.
Right.
And they'd been trying to keep the idea of the balloon bombs secret by suppressing the media because they didn't want Japanese spies to realize that it was actually working. And because the Japanese couldn't find out, they said, well, Americans can't keep secrets, so it must not be working. And they stopped them. But once the people had been killed in Klamath Falls, Oregon, they started a whispering campaign to let people know about these things. 3 of the balloon bombs were found in Iowa. And one of the reporters said that after she'd found the balloon bomb that she'd written the story to publish, and the FBI showed up and asked her not to publish it. And so she didn't until after the war was over. So I think they got as far as Michigan. They were found in Canada and far south as Mexico City.
Wow. What do you think, your best guess, what do you think Cash and Landon saw and were affected by?
Well, I don't know. I cannot believe that the number of helicopters they claimed were involved in this thing, because I don't know where they'd have found that many helicopters over the Christmas holidays. And then you'd have all the support people involved in that too. So that aspect of it bothers me immensely, but I don't know what they saw. And I know Phil Klass, and granted that's not, it's not necessarily the greatest source on this stuff, because I mean, with the Pascagoula thing, he was writing that off by attacking the guy that performed the polygraph examinations as opposed to the facts of the case. And in Cash Landrum is sort of the same thing. He was worried about their medical records and that sort of thing. It seems that after the event, they suffered from some form of radiation sickness.
Right.
And I know they sued the government for damages when they didn't get it because they couldn't prove that it was something the government had, which is kind of an interesting dodge.
Right.
That I really don't know. I know that both Cash and Landrum suffered medical problems.
Oh yeah.
Right after the events, and they mimicked radiation sickness. I'm not sure how badly the boy was affected by some of this. I know one of them got outside of the car and her symptoms were a lot worse than the 2 that stayed inside the car. But it's an interesting case.
Well, it sounded to me like it might have been an experimental nuclear reactor of some type that they tacked to a flying thing and were trying to get a new form of energy working.
That's as possible. Well, I would say that's more likely than an interstellar craft, simply because of the logistics of interstellar flight. But I don't know. Clearly, they saw something. Other people saw it. Clearly, they were affected by their exposure to this thing.
And just one more, Don. Can you share with the audience who did the deathbed confession of Walter Haut, and what is your view of that?
Well, the affidavit that you're talking about was written by Don Schmidt. Julie Schuessler, who was Halt's daughter, was there, and he provided them with the information. Don put it into a format that was, I was going to say coherent, but probably chronological would have been the better term there. So I have no complaint with the fact that Don put together the affidavit. I don't have a complaint with that. Walter Hott looked at it. His daughter was there and witnessed the whole thing. So that sort of thing is very interesting, a very credible document. The problem I have with the whole Walter Hott thing is he spent literally decades telling me and everybody else his only connection was that he had written the press release.
Right.
And in talking to him, it's not even clear he wrote the press release, that it may have been written by Colonel Blanchard and dictated to Hott. It may have been that one of the NCOs that worked in his office took the notes that Hott had written down and put it into the form of the press release. Hott, and we don't know whether Hott actually took it around to the various news media in Roswell or he phoned them and told them that. But we do know that there was a press release, and we do know Walter Hott was involved in it. We do know that it went out over the various news wires at the time. So we had that, and then around 2000, he began to hint that he had seen a lot more. He had seen the craft, he'd seen the bodies, and if you look at the interviews he conducted after that time frame, sometimes he contradicts himself in the space of a paragraph or a sentence.
Right.
But the other side of that coin is there's another side to this. I pointed out in one of the Roswell books that I did. There was a guy named Richard Harris, lived in Albuquerque, and I met with him in the late 1990s before Walter Hott started talking about seeing the craft and the bodies. And what Harris told me was he was in a hangar at Roswell during this time, and Harris was clearly there. He was in the finance office. He was clearly in Roswell. There's no doubt about that. And he said that he was in the hangar with Walter Hott. And Hott said, "You want to see the bodies? They're on the other side of that door." And Harris said he put his hand on the doorknob and he went to turn the knob and he decided he didn't want to see the bodies. I'm thinking I'd have been through that door like a shot, but he didn't want to see the bodies. So this is what Harris was telling me prior to Walter Hott talking about having seen the craft and bodies. So I had corroboration when this affidavit was published. I had corroboration from this guy named Harris, and I didn't accept his story at the time because Walter Hott had always said that his only involvement was writing the press release or involved with the press release. Right. So it's kind of interesting that we have that corroboration prior to Walter Hott confirming Harris's story in a sort of bizarre and ironic way.
I spoke with Walter a few times. I used to do a news thing, and he liked it, so I called him a few times. Very nice guy.
Oh yeah.
And what concerns me is going back to what Don said. If you're an investigator like Don and things, he's talking about Lazar never changes his story, and then out of left field, for whatever reasons, this whole new aspect of the story comes up. It's just very confusing.
But there's something a little bit different here. It's clear to me that the people at Roswell were sworn to secrecy about this event. Edwin Easley, the provost marshal, I talked to him a number of times, was very cagey in what he said to me, very careful in what he said. And I would ask him specific questions. He would say, I can't tell you about that. I was sworn to secrecy. Or I can't talk about that. I was sworn to secrecy. And he took most of that information to the grave with him. He made a couple of comments to family members just before he passed away that kind of verified that. Patrick Saunders, talked to him a couple of times. He was making fun of the stories of little bodies, little green men, and that sort of thing. But he told family members about this just before he died as he got older. I've got a letter from one of his daughters where she wrote that her father was telling about this. Says, now, don't tell anybody about this because there will be consequences for it. Keep it under your wrap. I talked to Tim Saunders, who was obviously a son. And he said that his father would really not talk about this until he got later in life. And then he provided the family with a little bit of information. Don and I did a book called The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. And there's a flyleaf that talks about damage control and what they've done to cover the thing up. And Patrick Saunders wrote on that flyleaf, this is all true. And I never told anybody and he signed his name, something like that. If you go to my blog and type Saunders into the search engine, you'll come to you can find a copy of the flyleaf, and you can see it for yourself.
What about Sheridan Cabot?
Sheridan
he
Cabot
ever-
lied his ass off.
Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, and what is interesting is Don Schmidt and I, not Don Ecker and I, too many Dons in this conversation, met with Kevin in Sequim, Washington, right after Richard Weaver, the Air Force officer in charge of the Roswell investigation. Richard Weaver's a great guy, by the way. I've met him. We've corresponded for literally years. Really a fun guy to talk to. We were there about a month after Weaver was there, and we're talking to Cabot about that. I said, well, I wasn't involved. We didn't chase down balloons or anything like that. And I said, well, the description is about a good old West Texas boy, saddled horses you rode out and that sort of thing, and gave him something. And Cabot said, well, that sounds like me, but I wasn't there. You go back, now you read the Air Force report and Weaver's interview with Cabot. Well, yeah, I was there, and I recognized it as a balloon right away. I'm thinking, why didn't you communicate this rather vital piece of evidence or information to Jesse Marcel and later to Butch Blanchard before they issued the press release? He was there. He saw the debris. It was a weather balloon to him, and that was the end of it. Why didn't you say anything at the time? The real point is Cabot lied to us, said he wasn't involved, told Weaver he was there. So what do you want to believe? His story. He said he always didn't go through checkpoints or anything like that to get out to the crash site. They was talking about the site where the craft and the bodies were found. I don't know how many people we've talked to that talked about the military cars parked along the roads off Highway 285, turning people back so they couldn't get out there. That sort of thing. So, you take a look at all that. Bill Rickett was the NCOIC, the non-commissioned officer in charge of the counterintelligence officer, worked directly under Cabot, told us about how he and Cabot had gone out to the site. And Cabot says, well, we weren't here today. That sort of thing. So even his own NCO said something like that. So kind
of like Richard Doty, you can't believe a goddamn thing they say.
Well, you have to be careful which Doty you talked about, because the father Doty was a colonel, and you can believe what he had to say. But he didn't have anything to do with UFOs.
Since both of you guys were in the service, talk a little bit about. We always hear this thing about I'm sworn to secrecy for various reasons. If there's companies involved, I got to sign the NDA and such like that. It seems very, very inconsistent that somebody like Lazar can spill his guts and nothing happens to him, right? Then you're talking to people from Roswell. Well, I can't talk about that because I'm sworn to secrecy, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't seem real consistent that they just wouldn't treat mostly everybody the same and just clamp down on you if you're speaking.
Well, I think one of the problems you're dealing with there is you're talking Lazar as a civilian, and we're talking about military personnel. And the feeling I got from Edwin Easley is he'd like to spill his guts to us. He would like to tell me everything, but he wanted to honor the oath he had taken back in 1947. He said to me that he'd promised the president he wouldn't talk about it. And of course, all the skeptics say, well, you think a president would be talking to a lowly major? And I'm thinking, let's see, a president talked to a lowly lieutenant colonel named Doolittle, and the next thing we know, we're bombing Tokyo. So yeah, the president might talk to a lowly ranking mid-level military officer. But they said, well, I think what happened was he talked to Secret Service man. Secret Service man says the president would like you not to talk about that, and easily felt the obligation of the oath. Now, you can say what you want about that, but there is a letter from the Secret Service thanking Easley for his cooperation. Mm. So we can verify some of that stuff. So I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is if you prosecute somebody for violating the secrecy, then you've got to prove that the secret was real, and now you're letting the cat out of the bag. So if they prosecute the people about UFOs who tell these stories, then they're it'll come out why that information was classified. And I think that's part of the problem. But I think with a lot of the military personnel, they honored the oaths they took. Some of them, Pappy Henderson told his wife about it. And Don would know this as well as I do.
I met his wife, Sappho.
Yeah, he was in the grocery store and found one of the tabloid newspapers, and it had the story about the Roswell case in it. It was after '89. Well, maybe it was in the 1980s, the first time it came out with the Roswell incident book. And he bought the newspaper and gave it to her and says, "Read that story." And he says, "It's true. It was all about Roswell." He says, "I've been wanting to tell you for years about this, but I just couldn't." And he says, "But I guess since it's in the newspaper, I can tell you about it now." And the answer is no, you really couldn't, because you got it from the classified sources. It doesn't matter what the newspaper prints, no matter how true the newspaper story is, you cannot verify that. I had an incident when I was in the Air Force at Richards Gebauer Air Force Base. And I'd read the classified stuff that had come in, the intelligence briefs that had come in the morning, got a call from a reporter from the Kansas City Star. He knew all about it. And he wanted verification. And I'm thinking, I can't tell this guy this. I don't care what he knows. And so I just played dumb. I said, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't seen anything about that. And he said, "Well, you're a pretty lousy intelligence officer." And I'm thinking, yeah, I'm a pretty good one, because you ain't getting verification from me. So he couldn't say, an officer at Richards Gebauer had verified the information in the story. So it works in different levels, and it really depends where you are as an intelligence officer. I understood all the nuances of dealing with classified material. That's why I knew that the top secrets needed to be stored in a vault as opposed to a safe. But other officers who have security clearances,
Not according to Hillary Clinton.
well, that's a whole different argument.
That's different, Don.
And that's a civilian. Again, a civilian. But
Government official.
yeah,
at the
you could
time.
say that.
So Don, based on your research and stuff that you've done, and you were in the service and et cetera, you got any uncomfortable stories that you could share about, I looked into this one thing, or I wanted to, and I'm not saying Men in Black or whatever, but you got the feeling that I probably shouldn't go down this road of questioning?
Well, really, the only thing along that line of thinking would have been my 3-year attempt at investigating human mutilations.
Right. Bring on the mic. Bring the mic up to your mouth.
Like this?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Hello,
Oh, no.
Can you hear me now?
No, we cannot.
In my ears.
In about 1989, I had already spoken to a number of people. This is when I was really getting my feet wet. I was contacted by somebody. You see, back in 81, 82, I had investigated 2 cattle mutilations. So although I didn't have a lot of background information on that, I actually saw the carcasses. I examined the wounds and that type of thing. And basically the case got shoveled under the rug. Now, that always struck me as kind of weird, especially the no blood business with the animals. But that always kind of stuck with me. And in 87, 88, it's when I got my first computer, and I discovered, and I got a modem with it. Back in those days, that was a whole separate thing you had to have for your computer to communicate. Yeah, 300 baud modem. And oh yeah.
Well, I know. I had the same setup.
And I discovered CompuServe at 300 baud, $6.30 an hour, something like that. But I discovered there was a whole new world out there where people were talking about these kind of cases. So I was contacted by the director for the state of Idaho for MUFON, about a case where a human body was discovered down around Jerome, Idaho, that had all the classic mutilation wounds, cored out rectum, missing eye, a bunch of stuff. It really is quite gross. But I got intrigued by that, okay? And I started digging into it. And one of the people I called and talked to was internationally renowned author, raconteur, and all around great guy, except when he was being a miserable son of a bitch, John Keel. Okay? Now, Keel told me about a case where an American husband and wife had been on a short mini vacation in Mexico, were coming back up to the Texas border, they're tooling along the highway when this human body severed in two dropped from the sky. Clear blue sky, literally a clear blue sky. This body, boom, down on the highway. And I quizzed him on that as much as I could. And I was, of course, extremely familiar with his book, The Mothman Prophecies. And so I started researching human mutes. And I wrote a paper about that I put on the Paranet computer BBS system back then. Well, that got out and around and literally around the world. And one day, I'm still living in Idaho, I get a phone call. I answered it. I was going to college and I was going back to Boise University, Boise State, taking a bunch of computer courses. So I didn't know who it was. He didn't have caller ID. I didn't have caller ID. So I answered it. And this guy told me his name. He was a DEA agent down in Florida. And I was kind of like, dude, how did you track me down? Well, if he was DIA, it wouldn't have been that tough, right? And he said, yeah, I wanted to call and talk to you. He said, I read your human mutilation paper. And I was a little taken back, and I said, oh. He said, yeah. He said, well, I got to tell you. He said, initially, when I read it, I thought you were full of shit. Oh, okay. Well, nothing like being direct. He said, until I started doing a little checking. And one of the places I checked was the NCIC. Now, I had already gone to 3 buddies who had been cops with me, okay, different departments. One was a detective at the Boise City PD. Another was a real close buddy of mine, was a deputy sheriff with a different county sheriff's department, and then a buddy back in Ohio who was a cop. And I gave them this criteria. I said, look, I'm not carrying a badge anymore. I can't do it. But I said, do me a favor, if you would. And each of these guys individually, they didn't know they were all doing the same thing. I said, if you would, send an inquiry into the NCIC, and this is basically the criteria I'm looking for. Number 1, unexplained, apparently homicide deaths happening in the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Nevada. Number 2, okay, and I gave them a list of some of the wounds and something else. I forget what it was. Well, my buddy at the Boise PD said, well, okay. He said, I can do that. He said, it'd probably be a few days to a week before I hear anything back. And I said, yeah, that's cool. So he did. And 3 days later, he calls me up. And he said, Don, what in the hell have you gotten me into? And I said, what do you mean? He said, look, he said, out of the blue, I get called into my lieutenant's office, and he immediately started chewing on my butt. And I said, why? Well, somebody from DC called him up and apparently chewed on his butt. Well, the bottom line is they said they got nothing to match any of that criteria. Zero. Okay. Well, I knew that was crap. I knew that was pure bullshit because at that time, do you remember the Green River Killer?
Yes.
The guy up in, that was murdering primarily prostitutes, mutilating them, dumping the bodies. I figured some of those cases would have popped up, but they said nothing. So I knew they were lying through their teeth. So this guy that called me, the DEA, or supposedly the DEA guy, he said, look, he said, when I made that inquiry, suddenly red flags started popping up everywhere. And he said, if I were you, and you do what you want, but if I were you, I would just drop this like a sack of potatoes because nothing good will come out of it. And I said, okay. And we chatted a little more and he hung up. Well, the bottom line was for 3 years, I tried to break through that. Nothing. I couldn't get anywhere. And so if I had any really bad instances of anything in my investigations, that would have been one. Now, with that being said, there was something else that happened much more recently. When I was doing my original radio show, UFOs Tonight, at the cable radio network, I interviewed everybody from Academy Award-winning film directors, Robert Wise, okay. I interviewed the producer of the movie Species. Remember that the first one that came out with that
absolutely.
chick? She was gorgeous, and she went topless in it. So that was
Absolutely.
also a positive. But then I had a show, several of them, that I did with my buddy Rich Saraday, and he was with the other. He was a guest with the other guest, a guy by the name of Michael Younger. Now, Michael Younger was not his real name. I know what his real name was, but that's the nom de plume he went by. And this guy at the time was creating a lot of froth in the atmosphere. He was supposedly involved with a group called Com 12. Now, I don't know if Kevin, if you heard about any of this or not. Incidentally, this guy ended up mysteriously dead, laying across some railroad tracks at the beginning of the last decade, right after 2000. Mysterious death. And one night, they were both coming in to the studio to do this show. And I was out there. We had a whole bunch of people that came down for this show. And somebody came up and tugged on my sleeve and said, hey, there's a guy down there in the parking lot in this vehicle, and he's got a camera, he's taking pictures, and he's writing in a notebook. So I went to Richard, and I said, hey, I got to get downstairs to the studio. You want to take a look and see what this is? Well, somebody had us under surveillance because of the guest, Michael Younger. And right after that, Vicky and I, would have a mysterious van several times a week come up, and they were keeping me under surveillance at our house in Sunland. And I know this for a fact because one day when I saw them out there, I got a pot of coffee and a couple of cups, and I walked out to walk down, and I said, look, I know you guys are busy watching me, but I thought you might want a cup of coffee. And as soon as they saw me walking out, they took off. So, so that was some weird stuff, but I never really got intimidated by any of that.
How about
So,
Kevin?
but-
You got a story that you could share that I was starting to look into
Did
something.
I say I was done?
Yes.
No, I didn't say I was done. Go ahead.
And you started to look into something and you got kind of concerned and decided to go the other way?
Actually, no, I haven't had any of that kind of fun. I've always thought that if there was intimidation going on, it would be against people like Don or me.
Right.
You hear the stories from people running their little local UFO groups saying, well, we were followed by this and we were followed by that. I've just never really run into that. I've run into brick walls where I couldn't get any additional information, but nothing to suggest I was under surveillance or anything like that. I know Mark Rodiger at the Center for UFO Studies was convinced that the office they had in Chicago had been bugged, that sort of thing. But I just never really ran into anything like that at all. And maybe that Don was a better observer than I was. I don't know, but I just really never had any trouble. As I say, I've not been able to get...
One of the things out here, Kevin, and there's a lot of blowback. Right across from me, over that way, is JPL. And then we have a number of aerospace corporations. And here's the thing. If any of them have any recovered technology that they're working on, and that what I was going to tell you, that I got a little sidetracked, the guy that was surveilling us at the studio was a private detective. And a couple of people tracked down his license, his PI license, and apparently he had been under contract or was working for Lockheed. So, whatever it's worth.
I just thought because of your military background and stuff that, in a general sense, they would have an eye out for guys like you who were involved in whatever you were involved in and your military experience, and watching you guys, hoping or that you're not going to do something silly with the information that you have.
Well, let me add here, because I had to have a background investigation for a top secret clearance. And it turned out that the OSI agent who was conducting the investigation lived across the street from my father. And so I know some of the things that were going on. So during the investigation, they had bought a number of magazine articles that I'd written that were critical of the Air Force and their UFO investigations. But I still got my security clearances. I mean, the fact I was investigating UFOs and I was very, very vocal on topics. And the same thing when I moved back into the National Guard and had to get another background investigation for the top secret clearance. All that stuff was out there and they all knew about it, and it didn't prevent me from getting the clearances. So,
right.
The only ramification I've ever had is right after I got back from Vietnam, and the company commander that I was assigned to, we had a personality conflict, and he used that against me, that I was interested in UFOs and that sort of thing. But I think it was just because he didn't like me and I didn't care for him either. So we didn't get along at all.
So before the end of the show, there's a rumor, and I don't know if it's true or not, that Grush had some sort of mental episode or some weirdness, and yet he kept all of his clearances and things. Do you have a view on that?
He was diagnosed with PTSD, but so am I. So it's not that big a deal. I don't know. I had other problems that could have, I guess I should say, could have caused trouble for getting the top secret clearances, but there was no problem. The fact that he had a mental lapse or something like that didn't seem to. It didn't. I don't see why it would have affected him getting his top secret clearance. I will say also this: the people doing the background investigation on me, I had forgotten to put my sister's name down on one of the forms, and they never caught that. So, all I can tell you is I underwent a number of investigations by the government for the various clearances I held. My interest in UFOs, my very vocal presence in the UFO community, my appearing on various TV shows and documentaries and writing books, it never really came up.
Right.
Well, I had a top secret clearance with a crypto access. I had to have it for my military job when I was involved in intelligence. And later, I found out that whoever they sent to do the background on me, and I guess there's a separate agency that basically does that. They went all the way back, believe it or not, to my pediatrician when I was a little kid.
Nice.
So,
well, also with the PTSD, who's better to work around that and know about that than the military anyway, right? So they have a very good history of being able to maybe suss out a person that, has a little bit of PTSD and deals with it, or they're out of their door.
In the last 20 years, there's a ton of folk out there, men and women, that have PTSD.
Right. And there's
anybody that's gone to Afghanistan, Iraq, I mean, you name it. They're out there, dude.
Right. So it's not enough to discount you offhand. Like, oh, he's got it. You got to fire him. He's done.
No, but there are people out there that would try that. There are.
Sure.
Well, I mean, we're talking about Grush here, and I don't see anything that has been brought up about his mental health or his run-in with the law that is really relevant to the discussion. I had a little bit of trouble with in the National Guard because a guy named Kevin Randle, spelled the same way, had a DUI or DWI or whatever it is in various states. And they asked me about it. And I said, well, when that guy got picked up in Florida for driving under the influence, I was in Iraq. And they said, okay, see you later, pal.
That's great.
Well, guys, I hate to say this,
but you will.
We are entirely out of time.
Oh, hey, real quick, what's the title of your book about the Zamora case?
Oh, Encounter in the Desert.
Okay, guys, I gotta come down hard. That's it for this week. Kevin, it's been a distinct pleasure. Stick around for a minute. And next week, ladies and gentlemen, will be Labor Day. We will not be here, but the following week, Commander Cobra is going to make a return appearance. That's it for tonight. Have a great weekend or have a great week, and we'll see you soon.